Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Layman's Dive. In today's episode, I discuss with Dr. Raquel about the possibility and potential for genetic disposition. Essentially, if one individual is more likely to be better or more akin or just in general favor sports, arts, whatever activity that you would like to fill in for that spot. Essentially, we will be discussing genotype, phenotype, and a lot of other genetics. I will be listing some key code words in the description, so if you are not sure what we're talking about, then feel free to check that out for a little guide as to where to put your thoughts. Thank you for listening to today's episode and hope you enjoy. So, before we get started in the actual interview portion, what are your qualifications? Like, why? And, like, give us a little bit more background on you and your research and everything like that.
Okay. Well, you know me and you know my name and what I do. But I started as a young scientist in Puerto Rico doing my bachelor's in natural sciences with a concentration in biology. And so that's where biology started for me. I specifically love genetics class, and that's where I started doing some undergrad research, some bioinformatics, trying to annotate genes in Drosophila species, so understanding evolutionary forces
Hmm.
that can shape what we were seeing in genomic data. And then I moved on to doing my PhD at the University of Notre Dame, where I still focus on genetics, but then I wanted to study other insects. So I was doing Drosophila research, and now in the PhD, I was doing mosquito genomics. So mosquitoes transmit diseases. I was trying to understand how these genetic phenomena that we were observing in the chromosomes was shaping epidemiological epidemiological relevant traits. So how the phenomena I was studying was chromosomal inversions, so
Hmm.
physical rearrangements of the chromosome, and how could that affect, say, where mosquitoes bite or time of mosquito biting, or where do mosquitoes rest. Think
Hmm.
about, we want to know where they rest because we want to place traps that are efficient. We don't want to place traps where mosquitoes are not laying down to rest.
Yeah.
Things like that. That's what I talk about. That's what I mean by epidemiological relevant traits. So I spent 6 years doing my PhD where I developed some tools, molecular tools, to identify these rearrangements. The only way we could observe these rearrangements was through microscopes, through observing at a specific stage. So we had to pick females that were half gravid. Um, when we have all those limitations, it's really difficult to identify these inversions. But I developed molecular tools, molecular being DNA. DNA can be extracted at any stage of the mosquito. You don't have to rely on somebody waiting for a mosquito to bite to catch it. We can
Hmm.
just catch mosquitoes, extract their DNA, and obtain this information. So I created some tools to identify some of these inversions so people can start identifying in which areas do we have X or Y inversion.
Hmm.
Um, and then, even though I love research, I love teaching too. So I started teaching at Notre Dame, where I did my PhD for 1.5 years, and then I moved on to Goshen College, which is where I meet you.
Hmm.
In Goshen College, I took up back the undergraduate research I was doing because it's really something we can do without much equipment, and you don't need that much money to
Yeah.
annotate genes. Um, and so I'm still developing those projects with my students, and I'm developing some microbiology projects too. It's still involving genetics. Genetics is obviously my area. Um, and so for the past 4 years, I've been mostly teaching, but doing some small work around with my students.
Yeah. Cool. So, next up for you, getting into the actual interview portion. So,
The whole question of today is there a genetic disposition to certain activities, whether that be sports, arts, music? Like, why do people feel a natural inclination to get into something? So, first off, do you believe that that is a real thing?
I love that you put belief in the question. I think as people and people in science that we try to be objectives,
Hmm.
and then we try to keep our beliefs from what the data can show us. However, that still is part of who we are. Um, do I believe? Well, I try to let the science tell me there is a sense of we can see what some people have in their genome, right? We have all these companies now where you can sequence your genome, and there can be some predictions onto what some people can have disease related. So can there be a genetic predisposition? Yeah, but we have to define what that is. The fact that you have genes present within your organism or your person
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean you're going to develop into what your genes are having. And that comes with the question nature versus nurture. And it
Yeah.
is the overall question I try to educate my students in that we can know what the genome is of our organisms, but we cannot know exactly what other influences are going to shape that. Because remember, we have the genome, but we have to express parts of the genome.
Yeah.
So, what's being expressed when in the development of that organism are being expressed, and what changes are going to be presented by the environment. The reason we're beautiful beings that we can evolve is because we can have the genome, but the environment also shapes how that genome is expressed.
Hmm.
So, can there be some predispositions for art, sports? I believe there can be. However, we have to be very careful how we define those with the exposure. So, for example, let's say, what is a genetic predisposition for sports? Let's talk about muscle fibers. Yeah, we're getting into the cellular aspect.
Hmm.
Somebody can have the perfect genetic expression of muscles to run a marathon. But will that person have the opportunity? Would that person have the money to sign up for the marathon, to train for a marathon, the opportunities, the time?
Hmm.
In this society, we know it's not all like that. So we have to think of the opportunities the organism has versus their genome. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. And that was actually kind of answering my next question too, because I was curious if it would be more about the actual sequencing of the DNA or RNA, or if it would be just the level of expression. And because isn't it something like humans share almost 99.8% genome and it's all just about expression?
Yes. And not only just expression in the sense, I don't know if you've taken other genetics classes. I know the class you took with me, which we stayed in the basics.
Hmm.
But when I go into these advanced classes, we talk about the different checkpoints of expression. So expression is not only RNA, it's reading that RNA to produce a protein. And so we have
Yeah.
different checkpoints. The protein has to create the 3D structure. Sometimes we modify the protein. So you can be reading the genome, but the genome is not going to give you all the information of the 3D structure of that protein. And so
Hmm.
there's different levels of disciplines. I tell my students, my area was molecular genetics, but I dealt with DNA and RNA. I never extracted a protein in my PhD. So when
Okay.
we so it's different levels. You can be a scientist of just RNA, you can be a scientist of just protein, just DNA, or a mixture of the three. And it's beautiful. The area of identifying 3D structures of proteins is still really new in comparison. So you have to go back to when we sequenced the genome, the whole human genome. We thought we were going to have all these answers, and we ended up with more questions. But that's the beauty of science, right? We now have a full genome. We can ask all these questions because we can access the information.
Yeah.
So would that be more genetic sequence or expression? Is a combination of all.
Hmm.
DNA, RNA, and protein, and how they are interconnected. So I want to bring up the fact that I was teaching you about Mendel, we had Mendelian genetics, which is what we describe as single gene a causative single gene that are causative to a trait. That's not really the norm. Mendel
Yeah.
just came up with, I mean, Mendel didn't know that genes were in there or the chromosomes, right? And he just happened to pick traits that were determined by one gene. In reality, that's not the norm. So the movement of studying just one gene has actually, we are now thinking of networks, gene networks, and how different genes in combination are maybe contributing to traits. And so if you are really interested in this, you're gonna be hearing more about gene networks and the networks and the networks and how these networks are connected.
Yeah.
Uh, and genome architecture. I don't know if you know what that means, but it's just how the actual DNA molecule and the chromatin, which is where DNA is wrapped around, right? The chromatin structure, the architecture of that is maybe if we were to stretch the genome, we have gene 1 and gene 2 very far apart. But in our cells, maybe gene 1 and gene 2 are really close to each other.
Hmm.
Understanding that closeness help us understand these networks. And so there's a new area studying that genome architecture and
Okay.
understanding where are genes close to each other in the cell and in different cells. Because
Hmm.
these genomes architectures are being observed different in different tissues. And it makes sense. Maybe you want gene 1 and gene 5 together in the heart, but you want gene 1 and gene 10 together in the liver.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shut up now, but that's kind of what I wanted you to envision is more than just the sequencing and expression.
Yeah. So with this predisposition, how much, and as we talked about earlier, all humans share a massive part of the genome, but would you say that there's a big enough difference between race, age, biological gender, all those factors? Or for the most part, is it just kind of, oh, this person is going to be sport related, this person's going to be art related, all that?
Well, predispositions for a skill is one thing. Now, having our genome defined race or gender, and I'm talking about just those two first before age, because age is something we can trace molecularly in some ways, and we're
Yeah.
trying. That's kind of the major question. How can we determine aging at the cellular level?
Hmm.
But actually, when we sequenced I didn't, but the humans sequenced the human genome, we actually couldn't find, and so far, maybe in the future, I'm not saying this, we couldn't find a definitive genetic marker or genetic marks that will define race or gender. We can define sex, and even that is a little complicated. You have your chromosomes X and Y, but you can have people XXY. You can have just Y. I mean, just X. So we have to think about those anomalies, which we call anomalies. But with race, in reality, there's no genetic determination for race. For
It's
example,
just environment. Yeah.
environment and races. I mean, you can um, in my area and maybe, and I know you want to stay away from sociology, but race is, if I can call it, a social construct because
Yeah.
let's say skin color. The
It's
reason
just
why they're
melanin.
exactly. It's just amount of pigment in your skin, and the amount of pigment in your skin was determined through evolutionary needs. If you
Yeah.
lived in the northern hemisphere where you didn't work, where you weren't exposed to the sun as much, you didn't need that much pigment. But then in the tropics, you will see an amount of increase of that pigment to protect against sun rays. Same
Hmm.
with nose. Wide nose allows for more air and humidity to come in. But in dry air, you don't want that much. So your nose becomes a little bit more narrow.
Hmm.
All of those traits were developed by evolutionary stressors and forces. Like I'm saying, you
Yeah.
could have been born with some genes, but evolutionary from the outside environmental forces could have developed that. And then humans came into the picture and started thinking that just because we had different traits, maybe we're more different than we are. But as we have already said, we actually share a lot of our genome all the humans in this world share a lot of our genome.
Hmm.
Um, with gender, we could say something the same. If you look at different cultures, we could see different gender roles or different expressions of those gender roles. I don't want to get into the spectrum, but just what we think of a male and a female and the roles that they should play in the United States might not be the same of the roles that a female and a male play in another part of the world.
Hmm.
So I try to stay a little bit away from gender, but I do like to talk about what we think of the sex of an organism according to their chromosome structure and their genomes.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if you remember, and I should not be talking about this because I don't remember exactly, but the hormone for women, I know I said it in
Estrogen.
class. Yes, but it's actually not even produced in the X chromosome. I'm trying to think. Let's cut that because I don't remember. But what I'm trying to say is we identify maybe a female by having XY. And yes, we kind of see that, but the hormone is not even produced on the X chromosome.
Yeah.
And things like that. So it's a little bit, it gets a little bit complicated when when we actually start looking at the
Hmm.
genome. And it's not just one hormone, it's a combination of different genes being turned on and off
Yeah.
at different times in development to produce the phenotype of what we consider the maybe gender or sex in this case. And with age, um, this is a very young field, and I don't want to talk about things I don't know. All
Hmm.
I can say is the genetic marker we use for aging, which is the telomeres, the ending of the chromosomes, right? Each time our cells divide,
They get
um,
a little shorter.
exactly. Our chromosomes get a little shorter. That's one of the markers we have identified, but we're trying to identify other markers. We're trying to really get to the point of how to can we tell aging. And I think that's something we will be able to determine in some way because aging is not a social construct. There's aging. We are constantly growing. Aging is growing. Aging is changing and replacing our cells.
Hmm.
So that is something we can prove that actually happens at the molecular level, at the biological level. Do we know all the answers? No.
Yeah.
Um,
No.
but we have been able to identify certain things, and all I can talk about is the genetic one, but there are other when we combine metabolites, which are products of metabolism, right? All the chemical
Hmm.
reactions of our body, um, and major shifts in the immune system against cellular level. Um, but I'm gonna stop there because I am going out of my expertise.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answer your question.
No, that's fine. Um, so kind of taking a little step back, would having a genetic predisposition be more population genetics or more per individual, or what field of genetics would you classify it in?
Having a genetic predisposition, what field? I think to understand predispositions for an organism and what they will develop, um, I think it has to be a mixture of both, but we have to start at the individual basis for sure.
Yeah.
Not just individual, molecular, cellular level, right?
Hmm.
Um, there's a field that I'm pretty sure you at least have read about, hopefully, single cell genomics.
Yep.
So we're trying to understand how different cells in one organism are different in expression and different in structure. So I will start at the individual level. Well, but what is the point of population genetics? So population genetics, I don't think can really tell us the predisposition, but it can tell us the alleles available in a population, right? It can maybe help us predict what new generations will look like or behave in a way if we actually know the single genes. But at the end of the day, the population genetic study is just trying to encompass what all these individuals' genetic makeups are. So I would say, if I can say it, yeah, I'm not a population geneticist. I would say that it's more in the individual basis.
Hmm.
And from the comparison of all these individuals, we come up with the principles of population genetics. But population genetics is the observations and predictions of how a population looks at the molecular level. So again, I would say individual basis.
Hmm.
Um, and even on an individual, again, in between, within an individual, like I said, we have gene expression and all those different checkpoints that can be altered, affected by the environment.
Hmm. So, how would you say, so going off of an actual cellular level, has there been like, to your knowledge at least, has there been an increase or decrease in the amount of study of predispositions or actually being able to quantify them?
It's a loaded question
Yeah,
because we are talking now about this with the knowledge we have, but there was a time where we didn't have much of the information genetic wise. And us as humanity still made assumptions
yeah.
about people's outcomes or people's possibilities to do X, Y, or Z at the race level, at the gender level, at cultural. We have been able to try to predict what somebody's behavior would do before we knew about genes. With
Hmm.
the knowledge of the DNA molecule and how genes interact, I think as humans, we always try to answer that question. Can I tell what somebody will become completely by looking at their cells and their genome? And I don't think it's an easy question to answer. I don't particularly have read there's a field, so there's behavioral genetics, which I am not at all. I have never done a behavioral assay.
Yeah.
I did not work with behavior. I did. Let me say this, but I didn't publish it. So I don't want to talk about. I was trying to induce an environmental uh, change in my mosquitoes and
Hmm.
try to read their genome and their expression levels upon those changes. Us, I don't know if you will see it, meaning as I don't know if that's what you're going to study in your life, but it is more complicated than that. So we have the behavior, the environmental cues, the different stages of development where we have shifts in the expression of different parts of the genome, which we're still
Hmm.
trying to understand. And even though we're talking just about genes, you have to take into account all of that organism's exposure outside of what cells are.
Yeah.
So, has there been an increase or decline in studies of? I think there has been an increase in us trying to understand this in different fields and different approaches.
Hmm.
And I think what we're learning is we need to combine more. I think there's more groups now where you're just not having genetics, you're having the psychology aspect,
Yeah.
you're having the behavioral genetics part, the developmental genome metabolite. So, have you heard about the omics approach?
Hmm.
So, not only, like I said, I combined in my PhD, I was doing DNA and RNA only, but there's more of a approach now of saying if we're going to study a genome, we need to study the transcriptomics, the proteomics, and the metabolics, all of them together in order to understand how the presence of one gene is going to lead to all these different chemical reactions in an organism.
Hmm.
So, yes, there has been, I think, an increase in trying to understand this. I don't know if we're anywhere close to, but I think there's a growing interest in combining some fields to try to understand these
Yeah.
phenomena that I think, like you have the question, a lot of humans have these questions of determining or trying to predict behaviors or phenotypes based on the molecular information we can extract.
Hmm.
I don't know if I helped in my answer.
No, that's good. Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, and biochemistry itself, just one aspect of that is already a lot. And then you have to add in the brain and social psychology and nature versus nurture, like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's a lot of factors to consider for one outcome.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Is there anything that you would like to add? Any specific either advice for anyone who wants to learn more about it, or just anything that you would like to add or emphasize or
What would I tell somebody that's interested in this, you mean?
yeah.
Hmm. It's really hard to say because you can be interested in the topic. And again, like I said, there's different approaches.
Hmm.
You can become a developmental psychologist, you can become a molecular geneticist, you can become a biologist, a biochemist. And all of those will be able to train you in some aspect of trying to understand a part of this problem or a
Yeah.
part of this discipline. So it's not as straightforward. Just knowing to understand that this is a very complex topic and it's not as simple as maybe we make it sound, or the conversations that we can have with peers, or in social media, that I know people talk about a lot of this in social media.
Hmm.
It's more complex. There's no one determined factor that we have been able to find for, say, a sports or arts. We have to think of ourselves as different cells. We have brain cells, we have liver cells, we have muscle cells. All of those cells are different in structure. They're all going to have different expression levels at any given time of a development in an organism. So really understanding all of that takes a lot of work and data and interpretation of it. Just because we have the data doesn't mean we're going to know it all. As again,
Hmm.
the human genome gave us more questions than answers. Maybe keeping on this will lead to other questions. And I think that's the beauty of science. Answering scientific questions through experimentation is the scientific method. Just because science poses more questions doesn't mean we don't know. It means that we're doing the exact job that science was trying to do.
Yeah.
Data, we post more questions, somebody else can answer those questions based on the past experiments, which I think is beautiful and which is why I am a scientist.
Yeah. I mean, we're just all building off of each other and adding to the general knowledge pool. So
Mhm.